Good evening, everybody. How wonderful to see you all here. My name is Susan Schnall. I'm president of New York City Veterans for Peace, a member of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and a member of we have a campaign, Vietnam Agent Orange Relief Responsibility Campaign, that seeks to reconcile both the Vietnamese who have been injured by United States actions in Vietnam over 50 years ago, along with American veterans. Tonight, I would like to thank the Quaker Meeting House, the arts, the peace and social justice people, and Marjorie Cornwell thank you for being so gracious in letting us use your space today, tomorrow, and Sunday. Marjorie, where are you? We have a plaque from Veterans for Peace that we would like to present to you and to the friends at the 15th Street Meeting House. Thank you. I know. It is an honor for us to work together with you. We discovered that we had been doing very similar work for over 50 years. So on behalf of those of us who have been in the military and come back and work for peace and social justice, thank you, Marjorie.
Oh, thank you so much.
March 16, 1968, in My San Province, My Lai Village, Vietnam, United States soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, 11th Brigade, 27th Americal Infantry Division, driven by commands ordering them to kill anything that moved, massacred 503 unarmed Vietnamese, babies, children, old women, and men, torched their hooches, ransacked their village. In 2019, Veterans for Peace is continuing our 50th commemoration of that tragedy. New York City Veterans for Peace and the Full Disclosure Campaign of Veterans for Peace are sponsoring the My Lai Memorial Exhibit at the Quaker Meeting House. We will be here tomorrow and Sunday. Our representatives include people both from Vietnam, from veterans, and from those of us who have been activists in social and justice and peace. The My Lai Memorial honors the Vietnamese who died in the American War. The exhibit creates a sacred space where participants encounter a troubling and painful look at the people who died at our hands, with a clear link to people who continue to suffer and die in our forever wars. You all will have an opportunity to process your experience in a supportive environment with the artists and Veterans for Peace members. I would like, with honor, to introduce you to the Ambassador Pham Hai An, Deputy Permanent Representative of the Socialist Republic, who will be speaking first.
Thank you, Susan. Usually we diplomats at the United Nations, we come to meeting with a prepared speech. I came here without one. today. I came here with a heart full of feelings. The feelings are overwhelmed. I feel overwhelmed because of the friendship, the warmth, and the reception that we have from our American friends. I've traveled around the world, and everywhere we go, we find people who we think are strangers to us. They show us friendship, compassion, the support for our war, for independence. It is a really great encouragement for us. I think today's event is another occasion for me personally and for my colleagues and friends to remember, to think about the past, and to contemplate about the present and the future. I myself was born during the war, but I was too little to remember. I alone knew the war through the stories of my father, relatives, and friends. My father wasn't fighting the war in a conventional sense, but he contributed to end the war in a peaceful way. He was also a diplomat. He took part in the Paris Peace Accord negotiations. I myself and my colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Vietnam, we think the best that we could do to prevent war, to foster peace, is that we do the best we could at our jobs, which is at the UN, we promote peace and to prevent war and help other countries and people to avoid the experience that we had in the past. And I think that's the best we can contribute. And we try to do it not just for ourselves, but for our children and children. And so this is a very good opportunity for me to also recommit myself to this cause, and thank you very much for this.
Thank you. I'd now like to introduce you to Mac MacDevitt, who is the creator of the exhibit that some of you have seen. I've heard different comments from people about how meaningful and emotionally searing the exhibit is. And I'd like to introduce Mac to talk a little bit about the exhibit. Mac?
Oh, thank you so much for all being here. Thank you to the New York City chapter of Veterans for Peace, the New Jersey chapter, and the Quaker Meeting. I'm a guy who grew up in the 60s and have always had crazy ideas. I won't tell you any of the other ones I've had, but my wife for about 40 years has long suffered my crazy ideas. But I used to say to my friends, you know, before I die, I'd like to see a memorial to the people who suffer in our wars. And then when I heard the Pentagon, I became a member of Veterans for Peace. I'm not a veteran, I'm an associate member. I stayed out of the military very deliberately. When I found the Pentagon was going to spend $63 million sort of commemorating the war and actually glorifying the war, I looked through their goals, and there was nothing about the suffering we caused to the people who lived in Vietnam. And I had one of those moments at the Veterans for Peace meeting that said, you know, we should do something about this. And the response I got was, we? So I just decided that I would make an exhibit, I would honor these people. Maybe it would be in cardboard, I didn't know. Maybe I'd stand on street corners. But I think that In our country, we have the privilege to go to war in other people's country. That's what being an empire is about. And when we go to war in somebody else's country, it should just from the beginning just break our hearts, because there are people much like us just trying to live their lives there. Do what we all do, raise family, find friends, get a job, have enough to eat. But it's so easy for us because we take up so much space. We're so powerful. We're so exceptional. We have so many armaments for it to be, and so many photographers and journalists. It can be all about us. So the exhibit is just an attempt to say, wait a minute, who were these people? What did we do to them? We know a lot about our veterans, what it was like to be there for a year. What was it like to live there for 10 years in the war zone? And of course, I'm standing on the shoulders of people like Jonathan Schell and Nick Turse and Seymour Hersh and other journalists and people who've written extensively about this. I just stole everything that I could find for this. Anyway, so I'm in this crazy 60s road trip going around the country with this exhibit, and I've experienced so much generosity and so much welcome and so much gratitude. I didn't know if anybody, you know how sometimes you care about something, you wonder, does anybody else care? I didn't know that there were other people who would care so much about this too. So anyway, thank you. Please, spend time at the exhibit. There's a couple things you can do. One is you can contribute your own voice to the exhibit. There's many ways to do that. You can contribute your own art to the exhibit. There are a number of ways to do that, okay? The exhibit is always free everywhere we've gone, but you can make a donation either online at mylaimemorial.org or, if cash is weighing you down, put some in the donation jar. But again, thank you so much for your welcome. Thanks so much for being here. And thank you so much for the folks on the ground who've really put this all together. All I have to do is show up with the exhibit. Veterans for Peace, Quakers, they do all the other work. Okay, thank you very much.
Family asked me why I have this passion for working on issues related to the legacies of the American war in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. Problems from the past where there are so many terrible cruelties and acts of atrocities going on in today's world. And I answer, because Vietnam was my war. It was personal to me that my government sent our young men to their deaths to destroy others in a country over 8,000 miles away. It was and is a war for which I, in particular, as part of the American military, am responsible. It was our government, it was our corporations, it was our factories that produced weapons of war. It was our military that dropped bombs and sprayed poisons over a land and people that would last for generations. I come before you today as a Vietnam-era veteran of the American war in Vietnam to recognize and take responsibility for my government's war on Vietnam. We, the American Vietnam veterans, took part in that war. We allowed the devastation to take place. Those once young American Vietnam soldiers have become old and live with the memory of what they did so many years ago. We don't want to be thanked for our service overseas. We want to be forgiven. We have a responsibility to those we harmed, to those who are harmed in our name, and to heal those affected. And we use this opportunity of showing in detail what happened in My Lai to remind people of what happened 51 years ago and to say we have a lot of work to do to begin to heal here and to heal the rest of the world. I would like to introduce you to Jan Berry, who many of you know, who is a co-founder of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. He is a poet and an author and a journalist and a healer and one of the very many wonderful poets that we have today, Jan Berry.
VVAW started here in New York City after a number of Vietnam veterans, somewhat spontaneously, joined a peace demonstration to the United Nations in April 1967. For each of us, it was an individual decision, and then we formed an organization which provided a catalyst for other veterans to join. I want to give you a little bit of background to why I got involved, but I'll also give you some background to why we're all here today in terms of the event that we're trying to memorialize. I don't know how you memorialize a massacre. Made some more Viet Cong today. A helicopter crew chief bragged to his buddy in the chow line at Tan Son Nhut Air Base just after I arrived in Vietnam, shortly before Christmas, 1962. That was my introduction to the war of free fire zones, napalming villages, strafing farmers in their rice fields. Killing Vietnamese villagers was the U.S. military strategy from the get-go, cynically camouflaged by the PR slogan, winning hearts and minds. A collection of poetry I co-edited and published in 1972 titled Winning Hearts and Minds, War Poems by Vietnam Veterans, included a poem that conveyed my outrage about the U.S. assault on civilians in Indochina. Memorial for Man in Black Pajamas. Trinh Vo Man was a poet, in his own land a scholar, to his own people a venerable and wise old man in his village throughout his native land. A warm and kind man to his wife and children and grandchildren, a humorous and tolerant man to his neighbors, an hospitable man to all, till the blue-eyed visitors came uninvited and shot him, because a man wearing black pajamas to them was just a slope, a dink, a gook, was Viet Cong. In Free Fire Zone, short stories by Vietnam veterans published in 1973 by my colleagues in First Casualty Press, Free Fire Zone is defined by the editors, all of them Vietnam veterans, as an American military term used to designate a defined geographical area in which all life is considered enemy. Any human or animal in this zone is fair game for all the organic weapons of the U.S. Armed Forces and is to be destroyed immediately upon detection. Plant and marine life are also considered hostile and are subject to repeated defoliation by Agent Orange and other chemical toxins. My Lai and neighboring villages were in an area designated as a free fire zone, well, as was most of Southeast Asia, including Laos and Cambodia. Shooting, bombing, napalming civilians was standard operating procedure long before the March 1968 massacre by troops in the Marical Division took place. We were told to kill every person. Dennis Stout, who served in another Army unit in Vietnam in 1967, said last year at the My Lai Memorial Exhibit when it was in San Diego. Burn down every house, kill every animal, chop down every fruit tree, and put blocks of poison down the wells. Many other Vietnam veterans made similar statements nearly 50 years ago at the Winter Soldier investigation in Detroit and at the Citizen Commission of Inquiry hearings in Annapolis, Washington, and several other cities. Vietnam Veterans Against the War Veterans for Peace in Vietnam, and other peace groups protested the war on civilians in demonstrations, public meetings, and in the news media in Washington, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, and many other cities. We now strip ourselves of these medals of courage and heroism. We cast these away, these symbols of shame, dishonor, and inhumanity, announced a former Marine sergeant as hundreds of jungle uniform-clad veterans stepped to a microphone and hurled their medals onto the steps of the U.S. Capitol in April 1971. Here's my merit badges for murder, a former Army Infantry Company commander shouted. I'd like to say just one thing for the people of Vietnam. I'm sorry, another vet said. I hope that someday I can return to Vietnam and help rebuild a country we tore apart. Many U.S. veterans have indeed returned to Vietnam to help remove old landmines, build medical clinics and programs to assist Agent Orange afflicted children and adults, and to provide various other services in the spirit of reconciliation. I'm proud to say that VVAW, Veterans for Peace, and other groups such as Teachers for Vietnam that I'm also part of continue to do so. Thank you.
Our next speaker did his action in 1966, and I just have to admit with enormous awe that I have that somebody deliberately spoke out in public in 1966, somebody who was in the American military and given orders to go to Vietnam. And he did so, knowing that he would face prison. I think a lot of us were active in the 60s and the 70s, and I have to admit, despite what actions I took, the thought of going to prison was terrifying to me. So one of my personal heroes from 1966, J.J. Johnson, who spoke out and spent 3 years in Fort Leavenworth.
I should say that I was also terrified. I need my glasses. I had to prepare my remarks, otherwise, you'll all lose me. But words really begin to fail you after you've seen the exhibit. I'd like to thank Mac and everyone responsible for it. It really is so moving. It kind of just knocked me off my feet. Well, I'm honored to share the stage with this roster of people's champions. But my appearance here is a consequence of my good fortune to have met and organized with like-minded GIs during the war. Each of the Fort Hood Three, there were 3 of us, agreed that we could not in good conscience take part in an illegal, immoral, and unjust war of aggression. We were able to remain true to our beliefs because we had the support of our loved ones, a growing and supportive anti-war movement, and the courageous example of the Vietnamese people. The exhibit we've gathered here to introduce and celebrate calls to mind Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. I say that because in the past, I often spoke about what some call the United States of amnesia. But on closer examination, it's clear that so many in our nations aren't really victims of amnesia, but rather they're victims of a highly coordinated system of obfuscation and misinformation. We know that those who profit so handsomely from the status quo have no intention of permitting the truth to set us free. The horror of My Lai should never leave our consciousness. But nor should we treat My Lai as an aberration. The journalist and author Nick Turse years ago informed us that My Lai was just one of many massacres during the U.S. aggression in Southeast Asia. Nurse has documented bloodier slaughters, such as Speedy Express in the Mekong Delta in 1968. Of course, we mourn the loss of the 58,000, mostly young men, whose names are inscribed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and those who returned physically and psychologically maimed. But I reject Ken Burns and Lynn Novick's false equivalence of blame on both sides. I mourn the death of more than 1 million Vietnamese soldiers, 2 million civilians, the 5.3 million who were injured, and the 11 million Vietnamese who were driven from their homes. I mourn and condemn the poisoning of millions with Agent Orange. Last year, I visited and held in my arms a disabled child who continues to suffer from the poison. The past is prologue, and I believe reparations are still in order. The exhibit challenges us to remember the past so as not to repeat it. Of course, the U.S. empire skillfully adopts its aggression and military adventures in order to forestall protests and opposition. The draft was ended. Many ground troops were replaced by mercenaries. Pilots were replaced by drones, and TV cameras were removed from the battlefields. Yet the United States still maintains nearly 800 military bases in more than 70 countries in every continent on the globe. And the U.S., with about 4.4% of the world's population, accounts for 37% of the world's military spending, which is roughly the amount of the next 7 largest military budgets combined. Imagine all the people's needs that could be met with the $717 billion that's budgeted for war this year. War and war spending, by the way, are bipartisan. In 2016, for example, the U.S. military dropped 26,171 bombs. Last year, our nation bombed Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Libya, and Somalia. Today, our nation has the blood of thousands on its hands in Yemen and is attempting to overthrow the legitimate government in Venezuela. We must continue to sound the alarm, but I believe we also have much to be optimistic about. Activists from every generation are on the move and in the streets. We salute and demand the immediate release of VFP members Tara Koff and Ken Myers. Their actions, like this exhibit, actually connect the past to the present. And as we work with younger activists to combat militarization and its human, financial, and environmental devastation, we too can draw important lessons from their struggles. As a trade unionist, I'm excited about the wave of teacher strikes. But the movement of young people like Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, and others all hold lessons for us today. Last year, high school students organized the nation's largest protest ever against gun violence. And last week, some 1.4 million children around the world took part in a global climate strike to demand action against the world's greatest danger, the climate catastrophe. We understand the importance of developing alternative institutions, but I'm also encouraged by the emergence of progressive elected officials, such as some of the women of color who were elected last November. Chief among them, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, and of course, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But their success depends largely on what we do here on the ground. Let's learn from each other this weekend and draw strength and inspiration to prevent future My Lais.
And just in case, for some of you who may not know Tarek Koff and Ken Mayers, let me take a couple of minutes and mention to you that they're Veterans for Peace members who went to Ireland a week ago to work with Ireland's Veterans for Peace chapter. Their issue is that the American military and American military contractors continue to violate Ireland's neutral status in the world by going through Shannon Airport. So they went there to work with Ireland's Veterans for Peace, and as part of the delegation decided on Sunday that they could not just sit by and simply come back to the US without taking action. So Tarek and Ken walked out onto an airport runway to stop a plane that was coming from the United States carrying troops and military weapons to the Middle East. They are now in Limerick prison. We need your help to get them out. Yes, Ellen has a picture of them on the airport airstrip. Our next speaker is somebody who most of you know, Doug Hostetter, who I'll say again, I guess I'm old enough to keep saying this, I have known for many, many years. Doug was in Vietnam from 1966 to 1969. He worked near a village, near Air America Airstrip, near USAID, near the American Embassy. He lived in a home that was unprotected by anything. There were no fences, there were no barbed wire, and no guns. And I find it extraordinary. He went there as a conscientious objector, and he went there as a teacher to teach Vietnamese children how to read their language. And it is an honor tonight to welcome Doug.
Chào quý vị đồng bào. I was about 22 years old, just graduated from Eastern Mennonite College. When I decided that I came from a Mennonite community, very, very fortunate to have been born into a Mennonite family, and I can say pretty confidently that none of my ancestors have participated in war for 500 years. So that meant it was relatively easy to get a CO status when I grew up in Harrisonburg, Virginia, because they had been trying to draft Mennonites since the Civil War unsuccessfully. But I realized that the young men in my generation were being drafted and sent against their will to Vietnam. And I decided that as a pacifist, I wanted to go to Vietnam to do my alternative service, actually working with the Mennonites in Vietnam, in the middle of the war zone, in the middle of the war. It was an amazing experience. I learned a lot about myself, about my country, about Vietnam, and about hatred and war. One of the first stereotypes that I came across was, growing up in a Mennonite community, assumed that people that were in the military were the mean, tough bullies. You know, the kind of people that are always found on playgrounds picking on smaller kids. And I was really surprised when I got to Vietnam, and I discovered that the American GIs in Vietnam were nice, polite, good guys. They mostly had Southern accents. A lot of them had a darker skin tone than the average American, but they were nice people coming from good homes and good schools. And as I moved up country to the village of Tam Kỳ, where I worked in Quang Nam province, about 60 kilometers from My Lai, I got to know the Vietnamese that were there and the Vietnamese who were fighting the Americans. And I actually discovered that the Vietnamese who were fighting the Americans were also good guys. They came from good homes, good families, went to good schools. They were polite. They were kind. And I had to think, how is it that good kids from good families who are brought up with good values on both sides end up fighting and killing each other? As I looked, I realized a lot of it had to do with stereotypes and demonization. You can't get good people to just go and kill each other. They don't do that. We've all come from schools and kindergartens that told us to be nice and don't hit. And that's the people on both sides. And so to ask them to go out and kill each other, it's not a natural thing. So you have to really demonize them. So the Americans didn't talk about, the Vietnamese struggling for the independence of their country. No, they called them the communists. And everybody knows about the communists. The communists hate family, they hate religion, they hate country, and there's nothing that you can do with a communist. You can't reason with a communist, you can't talk with a communist. The only thing you can do with a communist is to kill them. Well, actually, when I got to know the Vietnamese pretty well, I began to learn some of their stereotypes about the Americans. They didn't talk about the American GIs coming there to save the South Vietnamese from the North Vietnamese aggressors. No, these were the imperialists. And the imperialists are people that come from rich, powerful countries, and they come in and take over the resources of the poor countries. And they take the women for wives or concubines. And the one thing that you know about an imperialist is you can't reason with an imperialist. You can't talk with an imperialist. The only thing you can do with an imperialist is to kill them. So part of the role of a peacemaker, of a pacifist, especially in the middle of a war zone, is to start breaking down the stereotypes of who the enemy is. And when I came to Tam Kỳ, the woman who rented me the house said, "This is really dangerous territory." And actually the CIA had given me a briefing. They said, you can go a kilometer east of Tam Kỳ, you can go a kilometer west of Tam Kỳ. Beyond that, the VC own it. You can go north and south on Route 1 during the day. In the evening, they own that too. But if you stay in Tam Kỳ, it's safe most of the time. So I remember Baang, when she rented me the house, she said, well, I only have a 4-foot wall around this house, and I didn't get around to putting a gate. But if you got a good steel gate and, those rolls of razor wire to put on top of the wall, and get yourself a 50 caliber machine gun for the front yard, then when the National Liberation Front comes in and take over, the Marines will be able to come down and rescue you. They're only in Chu Lai, that's 15 kilometers away. It won't take too long, and you'll be able to hold them off. And I said, no, Baang, that's not how I'm going to live. I never put a gate in that 4-foot wall. I never had any concertina or barbed wire. I had no weapons. And it was an amazing experience. I lived in Tam Kỳ for 3 years. The National Liberation Front took over probably about a dozen times while I was there. There were 3 big bases that had Americans in them. There was what was called the U.S. Embassy. It was the CIA house. But there were about 4 or 5 CIA agents that lived there, surrounded by walls and barbed wire and landmines. And then there was the USAID compound, also surrounded by walls and landmines and machine gun turrets. And then there was the MacV, the military advisors, a much bigger base, but also very heavily guarded. And every time that the NLF came in and took over, they attacked the U.S. Embassy, the CIA headquarters, MacV, and the AID compound. And I was the only American living outside of a military base with no gate in my front wall, and I was never bothered. Yeah, there were a few spare rounds that went through my roof a time or two, but nobody bothered me. And I went there, and I was told by MCC, find out what the people need and help them do it. I was amazed. The place was overrun with refugees because the U.S. had lost control of most of the province, and when you lose control of the province, you destroy it. So they were driving the people from east and west of Tam Kỳ into the refugee camps in Tam Kỳ. And when I went to ask the people what they wanted, the thing that they wanted most was for their kids to learn to read and write Vietnamese. Vietnamese is an amazing culture. It's one of the historic cultures that if you pass the right test as a peasant from anywhere in the empire, you could become a Mandarin in the emperor's court. And every Vietnamese knows that it is education that helps you to get away. They are amazing students, and they've done amazingly well in this country. And obviously, I was just coming to Tam Kỳ, just learning Vietnamese. There's no way I was going to be teaching any Vietnamese how to read and write their own language. So I needed help. When I went there, I must say I grew up quite provincial in a Mennonite community. All my friends and neighbors were Mennonites, and I really thought the only really good people in the world were Mennonites. And I got to Vietnam, and the director said, no, you have to be more open-minded. You have to include other Christians. So you'll get up to Tam Kỳ, and there will be no Mennonites up there. But there is a small Vietnamese Protestant church there, and those will be your brothers and sisters. So I went to the Protestant pastor and I said, would you let the Protestant youth group come and help teach the kids in Tu Hip refugee camp how to read and write their own language? He thought for a while and he said, well, actually, we go to Tu Hip every weekend. I preach a sermon and do evangelism, and the youth group, they sing Western songs. Actually, as Christians, you have to sing Western songs. You can't really use Vietnamese music to sing to the Christian God. But anyhow, they sing Western songs and they're busy on Sunday, so they can't really help you on the weekend to teach the kids how to read and write. There wasn't a single parent that I had spoken to that had asked me to evangelize their children. They had asked me to teach their kids how to read and write. So I had grown up, and Catholics were completely beyond the pale. They had persecuted Mennonites back in the 16th and 17th century. We knew they were terrible people. But I was desperate. So I went to the Catholic priest. And I said, well, would you allow the Catholic youth group to come and teach the kids how to read and write? The priest responded, yes. Just show me which are the Catholic kids in Tu Hip camp, and we'll teach the Catholic kids how to read and write. That was all right. There were about 10% of the kids were Catholic. And finally, and I knew the Buddhists were completely beyond the pale, but I was desperate. And so I went to a young monk who ran the Buddhist youth group. And I said, would you allow the Buddhist youth group to teach the kids how to read and write? And he said, yes. And he never asked, who are the Buddhists? Who are the Confucianists? Who are the Cao-Dai? Who are the Wahao? Who are the Communists? And I discovered, the students told me later, that his mother had been killed by an American bomb. And he became one of my closest friends. Vietnamese are amazing people. The Vietnamese government in the North started a committee of friendship with the American people in the earliest years of the war. And at least 300 Americans traveled to Hanoi during the war. I was one of them, privileged to do that, helped to negotiate the People's Peace Treaty. They are amazing people. They taught me so much. Thank you so much.
I'd like to close with a reminder to everybody that we do have a program tomorrow at 12 noon. We have a wonderful panel of speakers who will talk about 50 years ago and today, and talk about how we can move forward and deal with and stop America's forever wars.